Welcome, dear listeners, to Faded Hearts. In a land where blight had stolen hope and winter had claimed every heartbeat, Granite Peak stood as a shadow of what it once was: silent, dying, forgotten. But destiny has a way of rising where all else falls. This is the story of Seraphina, the outcast who became a Luna, the woman whose very presence awakened the mountain and called life back from the edge of ruin. It is the tale of Jax, the stoic alpha whose hardened soul was reshaped by love so powerful it revived forests, rivers, and the spirits of his people. Together, their bond didn't just heal wounds, it sparked a miracle. A transformation so fierce, so breathtaking, that the world itself bowed to it. This is a journey of rebirth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that turns wastelands into paradise. Welcome to Granite Peak, where the mountain remembers every triumph, and where a Luna's heart can make the world bloom again. The drums were the first thing to assault the senses. A deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated up from the soles of Seraphina's worn leather boots, through her bones, and settled into a nervous flutter in the pit of her stomach. It was the heartbeat of the verdant valley. The rhythm of the Great Hunt Festival. A sound every other she-wolf in her pack associated with joy, with courtship, with the primal, heady rush of life. For Seraphina, it was the sound of her own inadequacy. From her place in the shadows, just beyond the jubilant circle of firelight, she watched the dancers. Their bodies moved with a fluid, lupin grace. Their laughter carried on the cool night air. The scent of roasted meat, sweet meadow wine, and the intoxicating musk of aroused, hopeful shifters mingled into a perfume of belonging. A perfume she could smell, but never wear. She was a ghost at this feast, a silent observer of rites she could never partake in. At 22, she was the only adult female in the pack's long history who had never once experienced the burning, the sacred, biological fire of a she-wolf's heat. In a culture that measured a woman's worth by the strength of her bloodline and the number of pups she could bear, her body's unyielding silence was not just a flaw, it was a curse. It marked her as barren. Broken. A field that could not be sown. Her mother's voice returned, a faint, cutting whisper in the theater of her mind. "It's just not natural, Seraphina." Spoken years ago, but still fresh as the wound it left. Seraphina's gaze drifted to the center of the celebration. Lyra, the alpha's youngest daughter, was radiant. Her first heat had come a week ago, and tonight she was being officially presented. A garland of moonflowers crowned her hair, glowing softly in the firelight. The pack's most eligible males circled her like satellites around a vibrant new sun, posturing, preening, promising strength and protection with every move. A familiar ache bloomed in Seraphina's chest. This was the life she was meant to have. This dance. This adoration. This promise of a future. She wrapped her arms around herself, fingers digging into her ribs in a desperate, protective clutch. It was time to go. Her purpose here, as always, was fulfilled, to be seen, pitied, and quietly used as a warning to others. But then, the drums faltered. One beat. Two. Then, silence. A hush fell over the clearing. Every head turned toward the edge of the valley. A figure stepped from the tree line. A wolf, massive, powerful, its fur the color of wet stone. He moved with the stillness of a predator who feared nothing. Then, before their eyes, he shifted. The transformation was fluid, effortless. And in his place stood a man, all sharp planes and hard edges, as if carved from the very mountain itself. His eyes held the cold fire of a dying star. Alpha Jax of the Granite Peak pack. His name alone sent murmurs through the crowd. A ruthless ruler. A legend. An omen. He walked into the center of the gathering, silent as shadow, ignoring food, music, and ceremony. His focus was singular. He stopped before Alpha Alaric, Seraphina's leader, a portly man whose authority seemed to shrink under Jax's gaze. Jax spoke, voice low and rough like stone grinding against stone. The blight has taken another 3 miles of my land. The elk are gone. The rivers run black. My people are starving. A chill swept the festival. He had pleaded for help at the Council of Alphas and been denied. Now he stood here, a king stripped to desperation. Alpha Alaric forced a sympathetic tone. We grieve for your loss, Jax, but we cannot risk the contagion. Jax's lip curled. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm here to trade. His gaze swept the crowd, cold, assessing, predatory. Then, inexplicably, it stopped on Seraphina. For a long heartbeat, their eyes locked. She felt exposed, seen through. And something deep within her stirred, something that was not fear. Jax spoke again, quieter but heavier. I've heard the old legends, he said. Of a silent wolf, a shifter whose senses are unclouded by heat. One who can feel the lifeblood of the earth itself. His voice dropped. I believe such a wolf could find the source of my blight. He lifted a single finger and pointed straight at her. You have one, he said. The one you call the barren one. The dud. Gasps rippled through the pack. Seraphina froze, blood draining from her face. He had named her, publicly. Her secret, her shame, now laid bare before them all. She saw the shift in Alpha Alaric's eyes, shock giving way to greed. A chance to trade away his pack's embarrassment and profit. What are you offering? He asked. Jax didn't hesitate. Everything I have left. My pack's entire winter store. Enough to feed you for 2 seasons. The crowd murmured. A fortune for a broken girl. The irony cut deep. Alaric didn't even pretend to think. Done. He looked at Seraphina with the cold indifference one might give a piece of livestock. Go with him. You belong to Granite Peak now. No one spoke for her. No one protested. 2 of Jax's warriors stepped forward, flanking her. As they led her away, she turned one last time. Across the firelight, she met her mother's gaze. There was no grief there. Only relief. The relief of a problem finally solved. And as Seraphina walked away from the only home she had ever known, one bitter thought consumed her. A field that cannot be sown, is fit only to be sold. The journey north was a silent, brutal tutorial in despair. For 3 days, they climbed, leaving the soft, rolling hills and lush greenery of the verdant valley bleeding away behind them. Seraphina was mounted on a scrawny mare, with ribs like a washboard. Its weary gait was a constant reminder of the pervasive starvation that gripped this new pack. Her hands were bound, not tightly, but with a symbolic finality that chafed more than the rope itself. She was property now, a living, breathing contract. Jax's warriors, a half-dozen grim-faced males, flanked her. They were ghosts of what shifters should be, gaunt, their cheekbones sharp, their eyes holding a hollowed-out look that spoke of watching their world die by inches. They didn't speak to her. They didn't even truly look at her. They looked through her. Their gazes were a mixture of bitter resentment and a desperate, fragile hope that was almost worse. She was a useless mouth to feed. A constant, living reminder of the fortune their alpha had spent on a myth. A barren wolf to solve a barren land. Jax himself rode at the head of the procession. A thundercloud on a midnight black stallion. His back was a rigid wall of muscle and responsibility, a fortress of an alpha who refused to bend, even as his world crumbled. Every line of his body screamed tension. He was at war with himself. The beast within him, the primal, possessive wolf, howled for the female who rode behind him. Mate. Ours. Protect. The instinct was a physical clawing in his gut, a savage urge to turn his stallion around, sweep her into his arms, and ride until they were far from the prying eyes of both their packs. But the alpha, the man, was stronger. His pack was dying. Their children were wasting away. He had traded his last resources for a legend, for a desperate, last-ditch gamble. A mate was a catastrophic complication he could not afford. She was a distraction, a weakness, a vulnerability in his armor. And so, he crushed the instinct. He ignored the howl of his wolf. He treated her as he must, not as a mate, but as a tool, a key. And the effort of it, the constant, brutal suppression of his own nature, made him cold and hard and cruel. With every mile, the land grew more hostile. The vibrant life force of the earth grew fainter. It was like listening to a beloved song fade into static. Here, the song was weak, struggling, a thready pulse beneath a suffocating blanket of decay. On the third day, they crested a high pass, and she saw it. Granite Peak Hold was not a settlement, it was a scar. A fortress carved from the mountain's stony heart. Its towers clawing at a perpetually overcast sky like skeletal fingers. The pack members who greeted them at the gate were specters. When they saw Seraphina, their gazes hardened with a collective, weary hostility. She was the price of their alpha's folly. Jax dismounted, his movements stiff with exhaustion. He gestured to a severe-looking she-wolf. "Kaelin," he commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Get her settled. Then bring her to me. Her work begins at dawn." Kaelin's eyes, the color of chips of ice, raked over Seraphina with undisguised contempt. She grabbed Seraphina's arm, her grip like a vice. "This way, dud," she sneered, the slur a casual cruelty. Seraphina was led through cold, echoing corridors to a small chamber. It was a cage, however well appointed. She was truly, utterly alone. Sleep, when it finally came, was no escape. Her dreams were a suffocating tapestry of the land's pain. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering, the feeling of wrongness more intense than ever. But this time, for the first time, she felt something else beneath it. A direction. A faint, sickly trail of energy, like the slime trail of a slug, leading up. Up, into the mountain's highest, most treacherous peaks. At dawn, Jax was waiting for her in the great hall. He turned as she entered, his gaze sharp and impatient. "Well," he demanded, his voice rough. "Can you feel it? Or was this all a waste?" Seraphina hesitated, her throat dry. "It's quiet," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The earth. It's not singing here. It's weeping." She pointed a trembling finger toward the snow-dusted peaks. "The weeping is loudest, from up there." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even a sliver of raw, desperate hope, crossed Jax's face before it was shuttered away behind his granite mask. He studied her for a long moment. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Then that is where we will go," he said. He tossed her a thick, fur-lined cloak that smelled faintly of him. "Keep up," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I won't slow down for you." As they began the arduous climb, Seraphina focused on the feeling. The cold trail of decay. The very thing that had made her an outcast was now her only asset. And as she followed the trail of death into the heart of the mountain, she felt the cold assessing gaze of the alpha on her back, his desperate hope a weight heavier than any stone. The higher they climbed, the more the world seemed to hold its breath. Air thinned until every inhale cut like ice. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on frost and the low, restless howl of the wind. For Jax's warriors, it was a brutal climb. For Seraphina, it was a descent into something deeper. The mountain's sorrow pressed against her ribs, no longer a whisper, but a constant moan, vibrating in her bones. She felt the mountain's lifeblood draining away, the corruption was tangible now, coating the air with a metallic taste that stung her tongue. Her focus narrowed to survival, one handhold, one breath, one step toward the sickness calling her onward. They reached Widow's Ledge, a path no wider than a boot sole, a 1,000-foot drop yawning below. The wind shoved at them like a living thing. Riker slipped, a strangled gasp torn away by the gale, until Jax's hand shot out, catching him effortlessly. A heartbeat later, the rock beneath Seraphina's feet crumbled. The ground vanished. She didn't scream. There was only weightlessness, then, a fist like iron closed around her arm. Jax. He moved faster than thought, dragging her back, slamming her against his chest. Her face pressed into his cloak, she breathed pine, cold stone, and the raw scent of male power. "Watch your step," he growled, breath hot against her skin. But the warning vanished in the charge that flared between them. The instant his skin touched hers, something ignited. A spark. A storm. Heat roared through her veins, wild, feral, alive. Her first heat. A lifetime of silence shattered into fire. The scent of it flooded the air, sweet and dizzying, impossible to ignore. Jax staggered back, eyes blazing black and gold. His control fractured. A guttural sound, half growl, half plea, escaped his throat. "You," he rasped, voice raw. Understanding slammed into them both. Fated mates. Her body had never been broken. It had been waiting for him. Everything else disappeared, the dying land, the mission, the cold. There was only the bond demanding to be forged. His warriors felt the surge of power and backed away, heads bowed. Jax swept her into his arms and carried her from the ledge into the shelter of a cave carved by time and wind. Inside, he set her down gently. The fire in his eyes was still there, but now it burned with tenderness. He touched her face, rough fingers tracing her jaw. The tremor in her breath answered his. "Seraphina," he whispered, her name a vow. Then he kissed her. It wasn't dominance or conquest, it was hunger and homecoming, the desperate joining of two souls that had been halves of the same whole. The world outside disappeared. What remained was heat, heartbeat, and the sound of two lives colliding. When silence finally returned, it was soft and steady. She lay against him, listening to the rhythm of his heart. For the first time, she felt complete, the emptiness inside her replaced by the deep hum of their bond. Then the mountain's song returned. Louder, clearer, and wrong. She could see it now, even with her eyes closed, a black current twisting beneath the rock, pulsing with decay. She sat up suddenly, a voice hoarse. "The stone," she said, "there's a stone deep inside the mountain. It's poisoning everything." Jax looked at her, eyes fierce with new purpose. "Then we end it," he said. Together. Hand in hand, they followed the trail through ice and darkness until they found the hidden chamber, a cavern veiled by frozen water, and at its center, a massive obsidian stone, pulsing with hate. It bled cold into the air, turning breath to frost. "We cleanse it," Jax said, clasping her hand. Their fingers laced, alpha strength and Luna life forming a single pulse of power. They pressed their palms to the stone. Cold devoured them, a pull that wanted to steal their souls. Jax poured in his strength, the iron will of an alpha. Seraphina answered with life, newly awakened, wild, fertile, fierce. Light met darkness. The mountain trembled. Then the blackness shattered. A wave of power burst outward, warm, golden, alive. It swept through the peaks, down into the valley, flooding the land with rebirth. The blight was gone. When the light faded, Seraphina sagged against Jax. He caught her easily, holding her close. Around them, the air felt different, lighter, singing. The mountain was alive again. He looked down at her, eyes filled with awe and love so deep it hurt. The silence of the land had ended. And so had theirs. Together, they had healed the mountain, and each other. The transformation of Granite Peak was not gradual. It was an eruption of life, sudden, fierce, and breathtaking. Within a single week, the gray, dying mountains were reborn. The blight didn't fade, it vanished, burned away like a nightmare at dawn. In its place surged a wild flood of green. The barren slopes bloomed with lush grass, thick and soft underfoot. Rivers, once black and sluggish, now danced with light, their laughter echoing through the valleys. Fields of sapphire, ruby, and amethyst wildflowers spilled from every crevice, their scent sweet and dizzying in the cold air. The prey returned first, great herds of elk and deer, strong and plentiful. The pack's empty storehouses filled again, overflowing with abundance. Granite Peak was no longer a wasteland. It was paradise, living proof of the raw magic born from a true mating bond. The wolves themselves were transformed. Where once there had been gaunt faces and hollow eyes, there was laughter. Their coats gleamed, their howls rose not in mourning but in triumph. Joy became a sound that filled every corridor of the fortress. And at the heart of it all stood Seraphina. No longer the silent wolf. No longer the barren outcast. She was Luna, the heart of the pack, the woman who had brought life back to their world. Jax had changed too. The granite of his soul was still there, but softened by love's steady fire. He was rarely far from her side, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with quiet devotion. Their nights no longer burned with desperation, but with peace. What began as a storm had become a steady flame, intimate, unhurried, endlessly tender. He worshipped her, body and spirit, showing her that she was never broken. She had simply been waiting to bloom. And she, in turn, soothed the warrior in him, easing years of burden with her calm strength. Weeks passed. Then small changes came, a lingering tiredness, a sudden sensitivity to scent, mornings when her stomach turned before sunrise. Jax noticed first. One dawn she woke sick, running from their bed. He was at her side instantly, hand on her back, voice low and soothing. When the spell passed, he studied her face, his brow furrowed, then slowly, wonder replaced worry. "Seraphina," he whispered. He knelt, one large hand resting gently over her stomach. "Are you?" She hadn't dared to believe it, but the truth sang in every beat of her heart. A smile broke through her tears as she nodded. Jax gathered her into his arms, his roar echoing through the stone halls, a cry of pure joy. He had gained a mate, a miracle, and now a future. Months later, her belly round beneath her gown, Seraphina stood in the sunlit solar when Jax came to her. His arms wrapped around her waist, his chin settling on her shoulder. "We have visitors," he said, a hint of amusement under his gravelly voice. "Alpha Alaric has arrived, with a delegation. He came last week begging for an alliance now that our lands are thriving." Seraphina stiffened slightly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the Granite Peak pack does not ally with those who sell their own," Jax said. "I'll send food. We're not heartless. But our loyalty ends there." Relief warmed her chest. She leaned back into him. "Thank you." He brushed a kiss along her neck. He wasn't pleased. He brought another delegation. "Your mother is with them. He thinks she can change your mind." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. Old pain had no hold here. "Let them come," she said softly. "I'll speak with her." They met not in the great hall, but in the garden Seraphina had cultivated herself, sunlight, green vines, the scent of new blossoms. Her mother, Alara, hurried forward, arms wide, voice bright with feigned pride. "My daughter. Look at you. A Luna, carrying the air to Granite Peak. I always knew you had greatness in you." The words rang hollow. Seraphina simply watched her, calm and unmoved. Alara lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Alaric can be foolish, but he is ours. An alliance would help the Verdant Valley for generations. You can persuade your mate, for the good of your birth pack." Seraphina's expression remained serene. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but unshakable. "You're right. I am Luna now. And my duty is to the people who took me in when I was sold, the ones who saw my worth when you did not." Her mother faltered, color draining from her face. Seraphina continued, steady and clear. "You never saw greatness in me, mother. Only shame. You were relieved when I was gone. I saw it." Alara tried to deny it, but Seraphina raised a hand. "It doesn't matter. I forgive you. Not for you, but for me. I won't carry your poison anymore." Her hand came to rest on her belly. "My mate has already agreed to send aid, because we are not cruel. But there will be no alliance. You may visit sometimes. You may see your grandchild. But our bond will remain what you chose long ago, distant and polite." She turned away, her head high. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my maid is waiting." Seraphina walked out of the garden, sunlight catching in her hair, leaving her mother speechless among the flowers. At the end of the path, Jax waited, his hand extended, pride and love shining in his eyes. She stepped into his arms, into the home she had built with her strength and grace. The ghosts of her past were gone, not defeated, simply released. For the first time in her life, Seraphina was free. And the mountain sang. Granite Peak no longer echoes with sorrow, the mountain sings now, alive with color and hope. Seraphina has reclaimed her power, her voice, and her place in a world that once cast her aside. Jax stands with her, no longer the lone warrior, but a mate, a father, and a leader reborn. The past has been laid to rest, not with bitterness, but with the quiet strength of forgiveness. Their future, bright and growing beneath Seraphina's heart, marks the beginning of a new legacy, one built on love, loyalty, and unbreakable unity. And as the wind carries their howls across the peaks, one truth remains. From the ashes of pain, they forged paradise. From the silence of a forgotten girl, rose the Luna who made the mountain bloom. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to love, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps the magic alive.